Welcome to Social Justice Ireland's annual webinar on the Sustainable Development Goals on this UN Global Justice Day. I'm John McGeady, CEO of Social Justice Ireland, and I'm joined today by Professor Charles Clarke and Dr. Kavanagh. It is now 10 years since world leaders embraced the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so it's particularly timely to take stock of progress. Although there is clear evidence of progress in Ireland, still challenges remain. Ireland continues to underperform in areas such as affordable energy, clean water, climate action, innovation and infrastructure, and gender equality. And this is dragging down our overall ranking. So even though we're performing well in other areas, such as quality education, economic growth and employment, and good health and well-being. Now, today we launched the latest edition of Measuring Progress, the Sustainable Progress Index, our annual report that measures Ireland's progress in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And it compares that progress to that of our European peers, the EU, the Eurozone member states, 14 of them in total. Now, once again, we at Social Justice Ireland have been pleased to collaborate with Professor Charles Clarke, from the Department of Economics at St. John's University, New York, and Dr. Kavanagh with the Department of Economics at UCC, who, as I mentioned, are joining us today. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for Q&A, so please do submit your questions through the Q&A function, and we will address them following the presentations. So first up is Professor Clarke, who will consider the meaning of progress and how it's measured, in particular casting an eye on gross domestic product, and then looking beyond GDP and looking at the role the SDGs play in all of that. So Charlie, I'll hand over to you now, and we'll begin the slideshow as well, please.
Okay, next slide. Or go to two slides. Okay, greetings from New York, specifically Queens. I'm glad to be here again. This all started 30 years ago when Sean Healy and I were talking about the issues of measuring progress and alternative ways of measuring progress. And in response to that, Kavanagh and I developed an index of social health, which was one of the earliest versions of alternative ways of measuring progress. And it was a minority position at the time, 1996. But what we see now is that the minority position or the critique of GDP has taken over the official measure of GDP. And so at the end, we will look at how the UN Statistical Commission has started a process of revising GDP and trying to address many of the shortcomings that had been pointed out, not just by us, but eventually dozens and dozens of alternative measures. And we have looked at many of these measures over the years, trying to highlight them to see if they might be of value to different groups. Okay, next slide. It's also the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith publishing The Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith is particularly important to the questions that we're looking at. Before Adam Smith, progress for a country was just getting wealth any way possible for the sovereign and the elites. And that is, conquering other people, enslaving populations, colonizing lands. It was very much a zero-sum game. If the sovereign was getting richer, someone else was getting poorer. And there was no interest. In fact, there was hostility to trying to raise the standard of living of workers. Under mercantilism, you want to keep workers poor so that they have to go to work. If you pay them any more, they'll spend all the money in the pub and won't be productive. And I can come up with a dozen quotes from people from the time period saying that. Adam Smith's book is a reaction to mercantilism, and one of the strongest reactions was this notion of progress for the elites as opposed to progress for what we would call the working poor, but it was just the vast majority of society. So, in addressing that question about wages being too high, we have this quote from Adam Smith where he says, not only is it against ethics that the people who create all the wealth get to share in it, but it's also an important part of incentivizing and growing an economy, that people who are well fed, have good housing, are going to be more productive. Uh, so the idea of the economy growing and everyone benefiting becomes a central feature for the classical economists as one of the main questions they were addressing. Now, the idea of measuring things is always based on what the government needs. And so we see this when William the Conqueror conquers England. He goes out to measure not only the value of all the land he just conquered, but also he wanted to get a sense of how much of a military could he support in case someone just like him decided to do the same thing he did. He wanted to be able to know what kind of defense could he afford. And that's pretty much why we got GDP. Next slide. It was during World War II that the United States and England, following the theoretical model of John Maynard Keynes, started looking at what is the potential output of the economy, because they wanted to both come out of the Depression, but also spend a lot on military equipment and personnel, especially the United States fighting in two continents. And so that's really where this all begins, that this is an important tool for government making decisions on what it can afford to do. After the war, the United Nations steps in, and under the leadership of Richard Stone, who was Keynes's assistant when he was working on how England could pay for the war, we get the beginnings of what we now call national income accounting, or GDP being the most important statistic. And it was used so that you could measure growth and also used to get an idea of what the standard of living was in each countries. And also after World War II, we started having the former colonies became independent countries, and then having them try to grow their GDP became an important part of the international efforts of we call the 4 decades of development. And that's sort of an organized way to try to get them to invest more, save more, and get more economic growth following a Keynesian model. And the idea that if you had economic growth, then everything else will follow. And here we have a chart that shows the most basic measure of well-being, being alive, so life expectancy. And the graph has 3 colored dots. The gray ones are the low-income countries. The orange are middle income, and then the blue are top. And you could see that as income goes up, life expectancy goes up, but that at a certain point, the benefits of more income doesn't really show up on living longer. Uh, and that becomes a common observation. The first time I found anyone who noticed this was in the early 80s, but certainly by the 90s, it became much more obvious that if we're looking at people's well-being, that economic growth, increasing economic growth, wasn't having a big effect, that the two had become decoupled. Next slide. So by the time the UN Statistical Commission updates in the 2008, right after the financial crisis, the next systems of national accounting, they actually have 2 pages on what are the limits to GDP as a measure of overall welfare. That negative things like earthquakes and crime add to GDP, and divorce leads to 2 households, so you're spending money on that, and leads to other costs. Lawyers, you're spending money on that. Anything that you spend money on causes the economy to grow. And so, are you measuring economic growth, Or, as one commentator once said, is it just social decay by another name? Because so much of the extra consumption was really defensive, dealing with pollution, dealing with family breakdown, things that don't make people better off or increase their well-being. Next slide. Now, in the last 25 years, we've come to see another of the traps of just economic growth and the idea of economic growth without limits. Now, Adam Smith actually points out a problem that at some point the economy will grow to a level where people are just searching for objects of trivial utility, he says, and also that the productivity of the division of labor would make everyone doing one or two simple jobs, so we basically become robots, and that will lead to the decline of civilization. So even in 1776, he saw that economic growth is important, but it's not the end, and it's not going to solve all the other problems. But we have climate change, which no one noticed then, which is the same economic growth is the same process that puts all the pollution in the air and that's raising the temperatures. And so the famous hockey stick graph, which I spent a lot of time last year on, that shows how quickly we've grown, we see similar graphs for the global temperature and for global CO2 emissions. Next slide. So, as I said before, the UN Statistical Commission, and I've been attending the Statistical Commission since I think 2004, and this maybe around 2000, it became a big topic in terms of the reaction to beyond GDP. And there are really two camps in this sort of battling it out. There's one camp who I think probably has a larger number of adherents because that's where economists like to have most economists have fallen. They think you could fix GDP if you could just measure everything. So if we can measure the negative and positive effects of pollution accurately, and the negative and the negative effects of family breakup, and the positive effects of parental care and home cooked meals, if you could measure all that, then GDP becomes a more accurate measure of well-being. Again, this assumes that all of our well-being either comes through a market exchange or can be reduced to being a market exchange. The other camp, sociologists and other social scientists mostly, but I would agree with them, argued more for we need to build out our collection of social statistics at a comparable level that we have for our economic statistics, and that they're separate, they should be kept separate, but that we should put as much attention on all the other aspects of well-being, not just material progress. Next slide. And this process of the new SNA, this takes years to be implemented. And so we'll see how countries, they haven't really got much guidance on how to implement it yet, but we'll see. It's in 2 weeks is the next meeting, so I'll see what the update is. Now, Ireland has a particular problem with GDP because the Irish economy counts a lot of activities as if it was produced in Ireland, which do not stay in Ireland. And these are all so well known that 3 times in a taxi cab over the years, I've had the cab driver point out the building that has Apple's office that accounts for so much of Ireland's GDP. So it's just, there are many examples, but in the first graph we see that Ireland's GDP has grown from being, 74, I think it is 74% of the average for the whole group of the 14 countries. And now it's at 170% of the average. So clearly the average Irish family does not have 70% more material goods or money to spend than the average of all those other European countries. And in all the studies, I've shown that a more meaningful measure of how much do Irish households have to spend is household disposable income. So that's really the money that they're spent. So that doesn't count all the money that gets generated that quickly leaves in repatriated profits or other ways to other countries. Next slide. Now, globalization and financialization are two of the main reasons why GDP in Ireland has diverged so much from the actual material well-being that it was supposed to measure. And this causes a problem, not just because it gives a distorted view of rankings, which, aren't all that important for the most part, but because GDP is a tool that helps governments make decisions. And if it's a inaccurate tool, then it becomes really a barrier to understanding instead of something that helps you. Now, I recently read this report by the IMF on European countries and how they're going to face the challenges of aging population, which gives you pension and healthcare costs, the cost of climate change, increasing defense spending because of Russia's aggressiveness, and then higher government borrowing because we seem to be leaving the era of free money, of near zero interest rates. And in that study, many of the statistics are all based on GDP. And so that if you wanted to, and this is basically what we try to do, is compare Ireland with the other 13 countries in the original Eurozone to see if Ireland's, has much less or much or higher, that, maybe we can learn from what other countries are doing to figure out how to improve it. Next slide, please. But here, the comparisons, and the study uses some of these comparisons, are really not that helpful. So in healthcare, it says Ireland's well positioned because they pay such a small percentage of their GDP in healthcare. Yet when you look at the actual money they spend, they're number two on this list. And so you just can't say, well, Ireland's well below the average, just start spending more money. Uh, Also, most importantly, the percentage of taxes collected as a share of GDP, Ireland's in the 20s. The average is in the 40s. Is it reasonable to say, well, Ireland could provide better services if they just doubled taxes? Well, we can't really say that because it's in the 20% of we don't know because the GDP number is so overinflated. And the last example I have here, and I did this big study on inequality across the OECD a few years back. And one of the most important statistics that we found was the share of labor in GDP, how much money was going to workers as opposed to how much was going to capital. And we see the average for our EU 14 is pretty steady. And there are a lot of countries where this hasn't happened. But in the United States, the share has gone down significantly. And here in Ireland, it's gone down. Yet Ireland has increased their equality, and the United States increased their inequality. All the other countries whose share went down, their inequality went up. And, why is Ireland an outlier? Well, they're an outlier because the GDP number is meaningless. But if we want to make meaningful comparisons, then we do have to be able to measure with some accuracy how much potential output the Irish economy has on its own, not as a venue for pass-through money. Next slide. Now, one of the effects of the beyond GDP has been more emphasis on other goals. And so we had 4 decades of the decade of development in which the UN system promoted for developing countries, you need to just get GDP to grow. Just do that, and everything else takes care of itself. And then in 2000, they passed the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and you had a 15-year period where economic growth was not a stated goal or the stated goal. It wasn't even a stated goal that the UN system was promoting and trying to assist countries in addressing. And you see in this graph I have here, the high blue line in each section, except for the first and the third. So the Western countries and the Western offshoots, they actually grew slower, but everyone else grew faster when they didn't target economic growth. So when you targeted the health and literacy of the population, you find that if people are healthier and educated, they become much more productive. And so addressing specific issues and targeting them, I would argue, is a more effective strategy on dealing with them rather than, well, if we can just get economic growth and then everything else take care of itself. Next slide. Okay, and as I've done in all the other studies, we provide just for the big ones, besides GDP, this is Social Progress Index, which has like 88 variables, the World Happiness Index, which is based on Gallup surveys, and that's a 3-year average, is where that data is based on. And then the last is the Sustainable Development Index that Jeffrey Sachs and the UN puts out. And we can see that, what index you pick will dramatically change where countries lie. And so the question of measuring progress and well-being is always more complicated, and the more metrics we have, the better picture we get to see. Okay, so now we'll go to Catherine, who will go over this year's Sustainable Progress Index. Sorry, I was 2 minutes over.
Okay, next slide. So please. Okay, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today just to talk you through our latest version of the Sustainable Progress Index itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is give a very brief overview of the data and how the index was constructed, and then I'll present the rankings by country. I'll also first talk a little bit about the three spheres of the economy, society, and the environment, and then I'll present the overall index. More detail, of course, is contained in the document itself, and I would encourage those who are interested in the construction of the index to check out our report. So, as we all know, the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, and in that, it identified 17 goals based on 169 targets and roughly of about 230 indicators. And of course, they came into force in 2016. Now, over the years, organizations such as Eurostat, the World Health Organization, the UN, the CSO, and the OECD, they've all committed to monitoring the SDGs and collecting the data that is required by countries to ensure that they do try and achieve progress with the SDGs. And also, since about 2016, there's been many research organizations and even the UN itself have been attempting to report on them. And as Charlie and John mentioned, Social Justice Ireland, of course, has been tracking Ireland's progress on the SDGs for many years now. So the first thing we did was to examine the latest report from Eurostat. So next slide, please. And here we have the 17 goals, as I say. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see, yes, this is the Eurostat report. These are the latest results from Eurostat. Now, Eurostat produce an annual report, and it's very informative because they track trends over a 5-year period in key indicators of the SDGs. Now, they don't actually produce an index, but the report is very valuable, I think, because they attempt to track how each country performs on the relative indicators. And they also provide conclusions of how they believe each of the European countries is performing. They use about 100 indicators in total, and 32 of these are classified as multi-purpose indicators so that they appear several times under different goals. Now, this is an interesting graphic here on the slide because it's taken from this Eurostat report, and it shows improvement in the achievement of goals has occurred at different paces really for the different goals. So up here on the very right-hand side, of the graphic towards the tip of the arrow, this is where strong progress has been made. And as we move backwards towards the left, we see moderate progress has been made on several goals. So, SDG 4, SDG 8 and SDG 10, the Eurostat classify as having achieved significant progress. But interestingly, down here on the left-hand side, what we see then is that there has been, much, much less progress on certain goals, but clearly there's been a movement away on goals 6, 14 and 15. So important environmental goals there. Now, next slide, please. So That's the Eurostat report. Now, there's also another body of research by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues. And again, they've been producing monitoring reports for very many years, ever since the SDGs were launched. They provide information on about 193 countries, including many of the less developed countries. And here they actually do calc an index, and each country is ranked by how far then a country is from achieving each SDG. So country specific dashboards are available based on their data, and they provide guidelines to policymakers of areas that are facing specific challenges. Now, this is the SDG dashboard for Ireland, according to the most recent report. And the colour codes here identify that progress has been made under certain goals. A green indicator or a green light colour shows that that the goal has actually been achieved, whereas yellow, orange, and red then indicate increasing distance from the SDG achievement. So really, based on the Sachs report, what we see is Ireland has, in their view anyway, achieved the SDG number 1. But there's major challenges, as we can see in the red ones, which are SDG 2, 12, 13, and 17. And many of the other goals are classified as significant challenges. So next slide, please. So now we'll move on to our own report. And the first thing to mention, I suppose, in our own report is that we are focusing, as Charlie and John said, on the EU 14, because we consider measuring performance of each country relative to what we consider at least to be their peer countries with similar levels of development is important. The second thing, I suppose, is that we do have a fairly extensive data set for the analysis. We draw on two key sources. The first is the UN Global Indicator Set, which was adopted in 2017. And then we have the EU Indicator Set, which includes indicators more relevant to the EU, policies and initiatives. So we try and ensure as far as possible that the final data set is closely aligned with the global indicators, but it also then takes account of the EU context. So we also employ a number of additional rules that guide our data selection, things such as relevance, applicability, quality and coverage, and the most recent available. As far as possible, our data refers to the most recent data that's available, and we also exclude data that is considered out of date. So overall then, we end up with 82 indicators across the 17 goals to arrive at our final SDG scores. Another thing worth mentioning is, of course, that for most of the goals, we have tried to have a minimum of 4 indicators. However, for a couple of our goals, such as SDG 13 and SDG 11, that's not possible. We have to make do with indicators that are available by all of our 14 countries. So we only have 2 indicators for SDG 13 and, for example, 11, for SDG 11, we only have 3 indicators as well. So if we move on then, I'm just going to very briefly to the next slide, please, just talk a little bit about our method. And again, I would urge those who are interested, as I said, to look at the report for more detail on this. I suppose the first thing is that we follow quite closely the approach that was adopted by Jeffrey Sachs and co. back in 2016. And the first step in constructing the index is to rescale all of the data, because this makes it then comparable across all the indicators. So all indicators are expressed in ascending order, so that a better performance on an indicator always implies a higher SDG value. And the value of this approach, I think, is that it can be very helpful in then benchmarking Ireland against these other countries at indicator level, at goal level, and also at the aggregate sustainable progress indicator level. So following the UN and Eurostat, we assign equal weight to all of the SDGs, and particularly when we are summing up, as all goals are regarded as equally important and should be indivisible as far as the UN is concerned. Now, we must emphasize that all the goals are independent and obviously interconnected. However, we do think it's important to look at the key 3 aspects, I suppose, that we're very interested in understanding. That's the society, environment, and economy. So if we move to the next slide, so please, I'll talk to you a little bit about what we call our economy index. So what we did was we computed the economy index using 2 goals, and those goals are SDG 8 and SDG 9. And what we see here amongst the 14 listed countries is that the aggregate score on the economy dimension gives Ireland a ranking of 6 out of the 14 countries. Might be no harm to maybe just provide a little bit of detail. So SDG 8 is all about decent work and economic growth. And this is calculated by us using 5 indicators. We use measures which are typical of SDG 8, such as GDP, employment, the NEAT rate, accidents at work. And obviously Ireland's GDP is high on this score, second only to Luxembourg. And overall, SDG 8 comes in a good ranking in 4th place overall, jointly with Germany. When we move to SDG 9 then, which calls for building resilient and sustainable infrastructure, we use 6 indicators to reflect this goal, and they include things like the percent spend on R&D, the percent of researchers in the population. It also includes a logistics performance indicator. Interestingly, expenditure on R&D as a percent of GDP is one of the lowest in our sample here, at 0.99%. Sweden, Austria, and Germany, Belgium are the exceptions. They all score high on this indicator and they have expenditure greater than 3% of GDP. But overall, the rank on SDG 9 comes in 10th place. So combining our 2 goals, 8 and 9, we end up, as I say, with Ireland receiving a fairly, I think, reasonable ranking of 6th of the 14 countries. So that's the economy index. If we move on now to the society index. Now, we construct our society index drawing on 8 goals, and those are listed over there on the right-hand side. And again, relatively strong position overall on our society index, where Ireland comes in 5th place. Okay, and it should be said that our relatively favourable position on the society goal is driven by really good performance on certain indicators, such as the education theme, which is SDG 4, peace and justice. We score well on that as well, coming in at 2nd place, that's SDG 16. And reduced inequalities, SDG 10, we're coming in and joined 5th. We do reasonably well on the health indicator goal as well, SDG 13, we're coming in 6th place. Now, just very briefly then, in terms of SDG 1, which is one of the goals we use, no poverty, we use 3 indicators to reflect this goal, and Ireland actually does well on the poverty rate, which is one of the key indicators, but less well on other measures of poverty. SDG 2 is all about no hunger. Now, we know that achieving healthy diets and ensuring agricultural systems remain productive and sustainable are the key challenges associated with SDG 2, particularly in the EU. And at the EU level, including Ireland in this, trends in the area of malnutrition do remain unfavourable. So rising obesity has obviously clear implications for people's quality of life and resourcing the healthcare system. And obesity is one of the highest amongst the EU 14 amongst our sample, and this is based on the Eurostat data. Also, at just under 5%, we see that Ireland's organic farming is one of the lowest, and it's well below the EU average, and we score very low on that indicator. In fact, we score 12th overall on that indicator, which is used to construct SDG 2. On SDG 3 then, which is all about good health and well-being, in the EU, this goal in particular continues to be characterised by relatively strong performance, it has to be said. And there has been strong performance in almost all the health-related indicators, which is similar to Ireland. Our indicators for this goal include things like life expectancy, a subjective well-being measure, indicators that capture death due to chronic diseases, the indicators of smoking and so on. And Ireland does relatively well, as I said. It comes in on 6th place on this goal, with Sweden, Netherlands and Finland again scoring highly on that goal. SDG 14 is one of the ones that we do particularly well in. And it should be said that education is seen really as key to meeting several of the other goals, because it aims at reducing poverty, unemployment, gender equality, contributes to growth, employment, productivity, innovation, competitiveness, healthier lifestyles, and so on. So, it does have a key role, we think, in meeting other goals. Our measure of SDG 4 reflects education at all levels. And it's one of the SDGs, as I say, where we perform particularly well. We actually come in second only to Sweden. The one area where we don't do so well, has to be said, is on adult education, which really is a reflection of lifelong learning. And that's one of the only indicators where we do not really perform in the highest ranking there. So on to SDG 5 then, which is all about gender equality. 5 indicators are used here, and the latest data puts Ireland it kind of in the midway of the ranking in 8th place. And again, the Scandinavian countries are the highest ranking countries there. One of the interesting indicators there in the SDG 5 is the gender pay gap. And we've improved on this, it has to be said, over the years. Our pay gap now stands at 8.6%. Which is well below the EU average. And also on a positive note there, Ireland is ranked first on the female education indicator, which is female education as a percentage of male education. So positives and negatives, I think, in SDG 5 there. Reduced inequalities is the focus of SDG 10. 3 indicators are used here, including the Gini coefficient, a measure of the income share of the bottom 40%, and a measure of household debt. And Ireland is in 5th joint place there. SDG 16, as I mentioned already, is one of those goals as well that we perform relatively well in. We're in 2nd place. So all of this really for 16, goal 16 suggests that Ireland is a relatively safe society with a low number of deaths associated with homicide and assault, perceived low incidence of crime, violence and vandalism. Of course, this is compared to our peer countries. And finally then on to SDG 17. Again, we're coming midway in the ranking here. SDG 17, as we know, is about partnership for the goals, and a strong commitment to global partnership and cooperation we feel is critical for the achievement of Agenda 2030. It's computed by us using 4 indicators, including Ireland's contribution to overseas development aid, the share of environmental taxes as a percent of revenue, and so on. So as I mentioned there, SDG 8 comes in with a ranking of 8th place, halfway in the ranking really. So if we move on now to the environmental index, so this is the final leg of those 3 dimensions, if you like. So country scores and rankings are shown here, and what we see is drawing on 7 goals this time to arrive at our environmental index. We end up with Ireland in 13th place, so second last of our 14 countries. Really, I think this is the area where, you know, there's significant challenges in meeting our commitment to the environmental goals by 2030. So SDG 6 is one of those goals. It focuses on sanitation, water quality, water use efficiency, and we draw on 4 indicators to arrive at our measure for SDG 13. And our analysis suggests, again, there's significant room for improvement. Ireland is ranked 13 on SDG 6. Moving on to SDG 7, which is about affordable and clean energy. Again, Ireland is performing poorly on this goal relative to our other peer countries. And this is because CO2 emissions from energy fuels combustion for electricity, they're one of the highest in the sample that we have. The share of renewable energy is one of the lowest. And certainly then, although there has been, you know, some improvements in the final energy consumption in households, we're still below the EU average on that score. So 11th place for SDG 7. Moving on to SDG 11, which we'll spend a little bit of time on looking at later on. It focuses on quality of life in cities and communities, including things like sustainable transport and adverse environmental impacts. We score relatively well on some of those goals, but there are certainly concerns about one issue, which is the recycling of waste, but also CO2 emissions from new passenger cars. We don't do so well on that either. And certainly the dissatisfaction with public transport. We don't do well on that indicator either. So SDG 7, which captures the quality of life, SDG 11, which captures quality of life in our cities, ranks Ireland in 7th place. Moving on to SDG 12, which is really all about doing better with less. So SDG 12 is constructed using 5 indicators. And, you know, again, we're struggling, I think, to meet our commitments on this goal. We're in 12th place amongst the 14 countries, driven mainly, it should be said, by the circular use rate, where we are placed in 13th on the ranking on that indicator. And the consumption footprint indicator, we're also coming in ranked 13th out of the 14 countries. So an overall score for SDG 12 puts us in 12th ranking. SDG 13 is all about climate action. So we use two indicators here. Clearly not ideal. We'd prefer to have more, but this is what Eurostat draw on two key indicators as well. One is the GHG gases and a measure of what we call the effective carbon rate, which is also a carbon pricing score. So despite improvements, and it's fair to be said there have been improvements on GHG emissions, we're still above the EU average. And combined with our other indicator, we come in 11th place on SDG 13. SDG 14 is about the conservation of our oceans. And we think that, safeguarding and ensuring our oceans for sustainable use is the critically important for SDG 14. Available data is a problem for accurately really measuring and capturing achievement on this goal, but we draw on what's available, and on that basis, Ireland is ranked relatively relatively well, it should be said, or rather, in 5th place on SDG 14, based on the available data again. But there are data limitations. SDG 15, finally, similar to SDG 14, monitoring of SDG 15 can be problematic, not just in Ireland, but obviously at EU level. There are pluses and minuses here again. Ireland scores well on the indicator, which is the share of protected freshwater, but it scores quite poorly on Eurostat's measure of protected terrestrial sites. The score on the Red List Index, which estimates biodiversity, is not very favourable also. And we have a low share of land dedicated to forestry, well below the EU average on that particular indicator. In fact, it's 13th out of the 14 countries. So overall, SDG 15, Ireland is put in 13th place. So if we move on then, what we see just very quickly then in the next slide is just a summary really of the rankings. So we see the economy, as I said, puts us in 6th place overall. Society, we're ranked in 5th place. And obviously for the environment then, as I say, overall, we're not doing so well in that, and we're in 13th place. And what we see there are just the individual SDG scores. So we've rankings at SDG level, by dimension level. And now what we're really interested in is how are we really doing overall? So let's move on and see what our sustainable progress index across all 17 goals are. How are we performing relative to our peers? Because this is what really matters. So our sustainable progress index for 2016 is a useful one single measure, and it's a good way, I think, of reporting on Ireland's track record relative to the 14 countries. And the fact of the matter is that the 14 countries all have similar levels of development, hence why we think it's important to focus on those. Overall, then, Ireland is ranked in 7th place, so we're halfway in the ranking. The Scandinavian countries, as we see, including also Denmark, are again, as in similar years, at the top of the rankings, with Italy and Greece, Portugal and Spain also doing less favourably down at the very end of the table rankings there. So I just wanted to move on then and maybe just shed a little bit of further light on SDG 11, which is the focus, I think, of our talk today. So an interesting, I think, statistic is that the UN has suggested that over half of the global population currently resides in cities because, as I said, SDG 11 is focusing on sustainable cities and communities. And the UN has said that that proportion of people residing in cities is likely to increase to about 70% by 2050. And at the EU level, the estimate is almost 80%. And we think that there are clear implications for things, particularly such as housing affordability, climate threats that impact on the environment and civil society. And now more than ever, we think there is a critical need to create safe, resilient, sustainable cities. And this obviously requires coordinated investments in affordable housing, climate, a resilient infrastructure and inclusive governance. Now, a key indicator that's used to capture SDG 11 is premature deaths due to air pollution. And what we see here is that according to the EU data, there has been a downward trajectory, and Ireland scores very well on this measure. Difficult to see there on the left-hand panel, the bottom graphic there shows Ireland on the left-hand side. So we're doing well on that measure. Another measure then is the recycling, managing municipal waste, and that's become a critical challenge, I think. It shows, I think, and tries to capture the vulnerability of development on waste recycling. And data trends for the EU suggest that although there has been no real reduction, and that's important, no real reduction in municipal waste, the EU has, however, increased the amount of waste that is recycled. And we think this is important because a key issue with municipal waste is that it's highly visible and closely linked to consumption patterns. Although, to be fair, it only accounts for about 10% of the total waste that's generated in the EU. And in fact, Ireland actually does much worse on this indicator relative to the EU 14 countries. In terms of the another measure, which is the CO2 emissions from new cars, the emissions have again fallen significantly over the year. As far as Ireland is concerned, we're still not doing as well relative to the EU targets. So some concern there that we're far off meeting the 2030 commitment there on that particular measure. If we move to the next slide, what we see here is another critical I think, a measure, which is one that is often used again to capture SDG 11, and that's the one on the bottom right-hand side here, which is road traffic deaths. And Ireland does relatively well compared to our EU 14 peer countries on that. And this is despite the increase in fatalities on our roads in the recent past. Now, I want to, I suppose, really just have a quick look at another very important indicator under SDG 11, and that's what's called the housing overburden rate. Now, the housing overburden rate is a measure that was as proposed by the OECD several years ago, and it suggests that people who have 40% of their income going towards housing costs, they would be regarded then as overburdened. So 40% of income or above is suggestive of an overburden rate. And in many cities, we know that housing affordability has reached crisis levels. And what we see for the overburden rate here, a bit of a paradox really is what I would suggest, because we do quite well on this measure relative to the EU on this particular housing overburden rate. It is very important to emphasise that this measure does not take account of those who are living at home, and that might be due to the inability to purchase a home, nor families and individuals that are homeless. And I really do believe that the trend in homelessness is, the past decade is certainly deeply concerning, and the reality is not captured here by this particular measure. Hence, therefore, I would suggest that caution needs to be exercised in using this measure, although it is used at Eurostat level to capture housing affordability, but I don't think it actually reflects recent past trends. So that's it. That's just a quick look at the numbers. As I say, I would urge you to go to the report to for further detail. But right now, I think we've had enough of the numbers. I think it's important now to pass you over to John to see what all this means on the ground and to talk you through some important policy implications. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And just a reminder as well, as Catherine noted, so the 2026 Sustainable Progress Index is available to download from our website, and the link has been popped in the chat to everybody to go to the publications section on our website, and you can download it there. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions for Charlie or for Catherine, please feel free to raise them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The particular utility of measuring progress is that knowing where we stand allows us to take action. And our report concludes with a series of policy recommendations intended to support government to better implement the SDGs. So if you pop over to the next slide there. Yeah, so look, it's now 2026, okay, and the 2030 deadline for achieving the SDGs is very fast approaching. And it's important to note that last year in the programme for government, government made a commitment to implement a whole of government strategy to fully integrate the SDGs into national policies and initiatives, ensuring that each goal is actively pursued across all levels of government. Now, clearly, this is going to require bold, concerted effort by government if it's to be achieved. And we set out, as I said, a series of policy recommendations that we believe can support Ireland in implementing the SDGs and achieving the Agenda 2030 goals. So if we go to the next slide there, as we've heard throughout this presentation, the SDGs really, they reorient policy away from blunt economic growth to a more focused approach to environmental and social, as well as economic well-being. So in recent years, government has developed a well-being framework which complements the SDGs. And the government's well-being reports titled Understanding Life in Ireland have been published now annually since 2022. And they basically assess societal well-being using a total of 35 indicators across economic, environmental, and social issues. And again, you can see there's obviously a comparison then with the three dimensions that we cover in our Sustainable Progress Index. If you go to the next slide there. So these 35 indicators that government use provide a snapshot of progress across 11 different dimensions. And these dimensions are, as you can see there, subjective well-being, mental and physical health, income and wealth, knowledge, skills and innovation, housing and the built environment, climate and biodiversity, safety and security, work and job quality, time use, connections, community and participation, and finally, civic engagement, trust and cultural expression. Now, the 35 indicators track progress both over time, they use a 5-year period, and by comparison with the EU average. And again, there's a complementarity you can see there with our Sustainable Progress Index, which doesn't track the EU average, but looks at the EU 14. So I think if you go to the next slide there, please. So while equality and sustainability continue to be included in the narrative of the government's reports, they no longer form part of the core progress measurement, and this really is disappointing. The inclusion of both equality and sustainability metrics serve to enhance the complementarity with the SDGs and so support greater policy coherence. Now, understanding whether progress is sustainable and whether the benefits are experienced by all members of our community is central to understanding our societal well-being. And as Professor Clark pointed out, this was self-evident to Adam Smith 250 years ago. So major challenges require not just the old approach of aggregate economic growth, as we discussed earlier, they require equitable and sustainable solutions. Now, notwithstanding this backward step, the development of a multidimensional framework to measure well-being is positive, and explicitly linking the SDGs to the 11 dimensions of well-being would help to mutually reinforce both and support policy coherence, as I mentioned. Now, last year, Social Justice Ireland began publishing an alternative wellbeing report, which continues to incorporate those two dimensions of sustainability and equality in the metrics. And you can also access that report on our website. Now, if we go to the next slide there, please. In today's report, we explicitly link the SDGs and the 11 dimensions of wellbeing in our policy proposals. And we also then link them to Social Justice Ireland's proposed policy framework for a new social contract. It's something we've been advocating for a number of years now. Now, we identify 5 overarching policy outcomes that are necessary for a more just society, namely a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance and sustainability. And we believe that each of these 5 policy outcomes are essential to be delivered in an integrated manner if we are to create a just society. And we believe that they complement the SDGs and the 11 dimensions of well-being. Now, it's important to say that not only are these 3 different frameworks compatible, again, this approach of bringing them together contributes to enhanced policy coherence. As Catherine explained, this year we ranked 7th out of 14 in the Sustainable Progress Index. So what do we need to do better? And this is where we lay out a number of recommendations. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now, our report outlines a series of recommendations to support each of the 17 SDGs. And for each SDG, recommendations are presented under the 5 policy outcomes for a new social contract, and then subdivided under the headings of the 11 well-being dimensions. And the full range of policy recommendations is really too extensive to go through in this webinar. So I do encourage you to download the report and go through each of them. But today we'll follow Catherine's lead by focusing on SDG 11, looking at sustainable cities and communities. So we'll begin with the policy outcome of decent services and infrastructure. And really there are 3 dimensions of the wellbeing framework that relate to this outcome. Mental and physical health as it pertains to community life, housing and the built environment, and connections, community and participation. Now, in terms of community health, we recommend increased funding to encourage sports participation and active lifestyle programs. And then in terms of housing and the built environment, we have an extensive list of recommendations, and these particularly focus on housing, which Catherine noticed, notwithstanding the metrics that we have used in measuring progress on this SDG and SDG 11. In actual fact, we know that housing really complicates this issue in an Irish context. So we believe that government need to set a target of 20% of all housing stock to be social housing by 2040, and to achieve this through directly building more social housing units, and then properly decentralizing responsibility for social housing to local authorities. We recommend that government ensure that no state land suitable for housing is sold by a local authority or by a state agency. Government needs to address affordability issues by concentrating on the supply side cost reductions rather than demand side income subsidies. They need to invest in new methodologies and reconsider higher density developments. And then government must also ensure that people with disabilities can live independently through increased resourcing, including suitable housing and housing related supports. Okay, let's go to the next slide. These recommendations continue. We recommend resourcing the enforcement of legislation targeting short-term lettings, encourage the right type of supply and reduce reliance on the build-to-rent sector, allow local authorities and approved housing bodies to actually pool resources to sustainably finance increased supply, review planning legislation to ensure that its terms are consistent with the objectives of the SDGs and democratic engagement. And then in terms of connections, community and participation, we recommend that government invest in the provision and maintenance of community spaces, playgrounds and youth centres, and that there should be increased funding for community development and for community development workers to build the capacity of local communities to identify and respond to their own needs and engage in the policy making process. If we go to the next slide there. Yes, so in terms of just taxation, income and wealth is the most relevant dimension of well-being. And again, we recommend that government set out a new tax take target, which would be set on a per capita basis to ensure adequate resources are available for investment, especially as windfall revenues begin to withdraw over the coming years. Ireland's overall level of taxation should reach a level equivalent to €15,000 per capita in 2017 terms, which is when we calculated that figure. Or in 2025 terms, that amounts to €26,866. Now, this doesn't mean we're recommending that each person should have to pay that figure in taxation. What we're saying that, per head of population, that's how much we should be collecting overall as a tax take. Now, this target should increase each year in line with growth in nominal modified GNI. Now, moving on then to good governance, we believe that safety and security and civic engagement, trust and cultural expression are the relevant wellbeing dimensions. And we recommend the government review building regulations to ensure good ventilation, heating and fire safety standards across all buildings. And we also recommend a review of planning legislation to ensure that its terms are consistent with the objectives of the SDGs and democratic engagements. As I mentioned before, it's also relevant under this aspect. So finally then, in terms of sustainability as a core policy outcome, we recommend that government invest in deep retrofitting programme for community spaces. And in the context of SDG 11, we believe this is central to the well-being dimension of environment, climate and biodiversity. Okay, so look, that's the recommendations we have for SDG 11 in particular. As I said, we have a whole range of other recommendations which you can look at in your own time. But I think for the purposes of today's webinar, I think that covers everything that we'll cover there. I think we can end the slideshow there. And we'll come back to seeing Catherine and Charlie want to come back on screen there as well. So as I said, I think we can take some time now for Q&A. So I'll just see there, have we any coming in here? No, yeah, we have a question here. Why did our government drop E and S indices? I don't have too much familiarity with that. I'm not sure if Catherine or Charlie has, or if the person asking the question wants to elaborate on the meaning of that. So we can maybe come back to that question. We have a couple others coming in here. Okay, well, this is a very straightforward one, in fact. And I think maybe Catherine might be best suited to answer this one. But Catherine, can we say whether Ireland has improved over the years?
That's a very good question, John, because we do say in our reports that, the reports are not directly comparative to earlier reports, and that's mainly because, of course, the data changes and the number of indicators, and some indicators aren't used anymore and new ones come on stream, and that's just the fact that the data is constantly evolving. But notwithstanding that, I think there has been, definitely improvement in some of the key themes, such as society and the economy. And it's important, I suppose, to remember as well that, even if we are improving on all of the goals, so are other countries. So we're still lagging behind in the rankings, even though we might be improving. So particularly, I think is noteworthy is the environmental measures, because ever since we started undertaking the analysis of the SDGs for Social Justice Ireland, we see consistently over the years that Ireland does not score as highly on the environmental goals, and that the environment dimension really is what's kind of bringing down the overall score. And that seems to be a pattern. So while you might say there have been slight improvements in certain goals or certain indicators, overall we're still kind of not performing as well as we should be. And I think there's a genuine concern that there are significant challenges under the environmental dimension in particular. But certainly, we've done much better, I think, under the economy. I mean, the economy index, that's kind of what we expected anyway. We consistently do well on things like SDG. And I think there was another question there, actually, because it's kind of related to that comment, John, is somebody was asking there about the data, and that some of the data seems to be 2003. Absolutely spot on. The data, we are confined to whatever data is available. Now, all the Eurostat data, you won't get 2025 data from the EU for most of the type of indicators we're looking at. And indeed, from the OECD and the World Health Organization, some of the data is 2023, but that's it. That's as up to date as we can get. So we are playing catch up. We're calling this the Sustainable Index 2026, but some of the data is obviously from previous years. That's just what we have to work with. But I think, certainly there has been, in my view anyway, some sort of an improvement in a lot of the goals that capture the societal dimension and indeed the economic, even though there are clear problems with some measures. But the environment is just one of those things, we just seem to be lagging behind. So yeah, that's what I would take from the data anyway.
Okay, and a related question to that then, given that Ireland performs relatively well in social goals like quality education and peace and justice, but poorly on several environmental goals, how should policy balance social progress with environmental sustainability?
Another
Again, maybe
great question.
have that.
Another great question. But I'm going to pass that one over to you. You're the policy expert, John. I mean, it is important, absolutely spot on that is the kind of and every country's grappling with that. How do you kind of balance social progress with environmental sustainability? And I have to say, I mean, it is one of those areas that's particularly difficult, I think, for Ireland, even though we have, I mean, as I said, made some improvements on the environment. So have other countries, and we are playing catch up. And there's clearly some issues there that perhaps we're not as successful at addressing compared to our peer countries. So perhaps you can more add some more light or shed some more light on that policy
Yeah,
dimension.
absolutely. I suppose two things on that. One is, the this notion of balancing. I think sometimes is overemphasized. I think it's clear that people have better quality of life when the environment that they're living in is of a better quality. And that really should always remain front and center in our minds. In terms of policy recommendations that we can maybe draw upon to improve progress on environmental goals, I think it's really noticeable that it was SDG 6, clean water and sanitation,
Mm.
where see a really low ranking of 13th place, and SDG 15, life on land, where we see a really low ranking in 13th place. I suppose with the SDG 6, one of the recommendations we've made is, it's very simple, but Ireland needs to significantly invest in our wastewater system. Okay. With regards to maybe before going to life on land, affordable clean energy, SDG 7, we had a ranking of 11. And again, there, we have they're simple, but that doesn't mean they're easy, but they're simple recommendations. One is, we need to develop a comprehensive mitigation and transition program to support communities and people in the transition to a low carbon society. And again, that's that piece about actually balancing both the environmental and the social. And central to that is the idea of a just transition, and that idea of a just transition needs to be front and center of government policy. We also recommend on that goal that we would upgrade the national grid and invest in the infrastructure necessary to support a transition to renewable energy. And we also recommend, invest in research and development for the use of renewable energy in our public transport system. And then if I go to SDG 15, the recommendations we have here is, we do need to increase afforestation of native trees and reduce the planting of Sitka spruce. This was a thing of growing Sitka spruce, but it's a non-native invasive species that we have brought in that really needs to be removed and replaced with native forestry. We also recommend that we need to have invest in programs to re-wet our boglands, and also implement the nature programs and the nature-based solutions that are already set out in the climate action plan. And again, very often, many of this stuff is already laid out in action plans. It's a case of actually government putting in the resources and implementing them. So, okay, we have a couple of other questions coming in here. One here from Shirley. I suppose these goals take time and then measuring progress, but clearly the will of government and resources commitment is key, as well as each of us in our daily lives. What about COVID times? There were lessons there too in terms of some goals. Any views? Thanks. So again, if anybody wants to comment on that, government will, and I suppose maybe Shirley is making the point that government seemed to be able to very, very clearly direct resources during the COVID-19 crisis. Yeah, maybe just Charlie or Catherine want to come in on that point.
I know Charlie wanted to come in there earlier, so.
Well, I did have a quick comment on the first question in terms of, is Ireland doing better? I was part of a group that looked at what factors contribute to human flourishing. And I was working with these, high-powered data analysts, and our main measure of whether people were doing better or worse was migrating into and out of counties. And then we looked at all the factors. And I think it was one of the first reports that we did. We looked at net migration as a sort of like your quickest indicator of how things are going in Ireland. Because for so long it was all negative. I think half of all the people born between 1800 and 1980 left Ireland. But now when you see, particularly if it's migration of Irish people, you have a very good indicator whether people are, voting with their feet, if things are improving or not improving.
Yeah.
But one of the issues in all this data analysis that came out of the financial crisis was we need data that quickly tells us the trends. And so many of our social statistics are 2, 3 years later, because they're just not collected as rapidly as, the unemployment rate is every month in the United States, or financial markets, it's every 30 seconds you get a new indicator of what's happening there. And we have never tried that sort of infrastructure and feedback on these other factors, and particularly things that the environment, because it's often the buildup that causes the damage. And so it's not so much it's not how much carbon monoxide you put in the environment this year. It's the stock that's been put in over a long time period that causes so many of the climate effects. And so this is one of the issues that came up when the Beyond GDP was being debated on how you could sort of measure these things in terms of what is the discount rate or discount value of a future disaster. How much is it worth addressing it now rather than dealing with the flooding? Those sort of questions. But that's the type of uncertainty that Keynes like to talk about, is that we just don't know the value of these things. Even though we know changes will happen, we can't predict or cost them out right now.
And that actually reflects one of the other questions coming here, sort of a half question, half comment from one of our somebody attending the webinar. Can we recommend that government provide more up-to-date data, especially on the environmental side? So again, speaking to what you just commented on, Charlie, Keith here makes the point, the UK has near real-time data online. Ireland's EPA has one State of the Environment report every 4 years, with data 3 years out of date. Not good enough. Again, can government and the EPA be encouraged to do better? And I think clearly having a report coming out once every 4 years is inadequate.
Yeah.
Okay, another question is coming here. Again, I think probably, Charlie, this one is most suited to you. A lot of economic analysis depends on indicators that, as Charlie has said, are totally skewed in the Irish context. Are there any possible measures of economic product that can be used for Ireland that is comparable to other countries? So you gave us a picture of other measures, Charlie, but what about an adequate economic measure?
Well, I mean, this is something that the Irish government, with the modified GNI, is attempting to do, but then you would have to do a similar type analysis with the other countries. And I do know people who are at the UN who are working on sort of a broader framework that reduces many of the effects of financialization and globalization that get added in to countries, but the money doesn't stay there. And so they have. I've gone to presentations where they're building sort of an alternative. The main issue is that often their work is geared towards developing countries, and because one of the problems with real-time economic analysis has to do with the effect on currencies and balanced trade and that sort of stuff that can move very quickly and cause all sorts of problems. And Ireland has the benefit of being in the euro, so it isn't open to that sort of rapid change. but I'm hopeful that, because Ireland isn't the only country that has this skewed GDP, and if and this is something the UN talks about but hasn't made any real progress. But if you could have more uniform treatment of tax laws, and uh, so that you don't have countries that can be tax havens, or if you could just learn how to deal with transfer pricing in a way that isn't so distorting, then you could have much more meaningful comparisons.
Okay. And then I think maybe we have time for a final question before we wrap up. One that's coming here. Why does Ireland continue to score poorly on gender equality in nutrition, despite strong performance in other social indicators? And what policy measures would have the greatest impact on improving outcomes in this area? So maybe in that question about why we continue to score poorly on that, Catherine, do you want to come into that?
Yeah, the gender goal, SDG 5, there are a couple of indicators in there, such as the share of women in national parliament, the share of women in managerial roles, the gender equality. And there's a mixed bag there. I mean, again, this is sort of what we've been seeing over the years. It hasn't, there's been some slight improvement, particularly on the indicator of share of females in managerial roles. But on the other measures, we're playing catch up, as I say. And the other countries, because if you notice, in a lot of these goals, it's the Scandinavian countries are the ones that rank highest. And maybe that's what we expect. I don't know. But certainly in SDG 5, they're the ones that score highest. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely something in or around what's going on there with that particular goal that need to be looked at a bit further. And as I said, despite some improvements, we're lagging. We're definitely behind on that measure.
Okay. Okay, well, listen, we're coming up rapidly on 20 past 1. So let me just, and a much earlier time in the day where you are, Charlie. And thanks very much for taking the early webinar and joining us. So listen, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Charles Clarke and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh for their tremendous work once again on this year's Sustainable Progress Index. The Sustainable Progress Index is a landmark annual report, and we really believe here in Social Justice Ireland that it has the potential to enhance the policy decisions of the Irish government when it comes to progressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the SDGs call on all nations to combine economic prosperity with social inclusion and environmental sustainability. And our analysis shows that while Ireland has made some progress, as we've noted, enormous challenges remain under these three headings. So, the achievement of the SDGs remains not only relevant as we fast approach 2030, but critical to our collective future. Events over the past number of years have really highlighted the interdependence of our economic, social, and natural spheres. The 17 global goals really do represent a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future. And despite global challenges, they do have to remain on top of the policy agenda if we're to have a more sustainable future for everybody. So listen, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.